So when I saw this book about democracy in the Fourth Republic, right, I was like, okay, now we are going to have another political. But funny enough, Michael actually has his first degree under the tutelage of people like Professor Egaga. His first degree was actually in English language. Quite funny. So now he's a politician or a political writer. And then from the University of Lagos, he went to the University of Wolverhampton in the UK, where he got his MA in Human Rights and International Relations, Merit. And from there, he went for his PhD in the same University of Wolverhampton from January 2013 to 2017. He has worked as a contributing analyst in Wikistrax, a college tutor in Southlands College, University of Wolverhampton. He is an academic visiting scholar at the Baker Institute of Public Policy at the Rice University in the US. He is a terrorism research fellow. I said it, Boko Haram. He is a terrorism research fellow at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism in the University of Maryland in the US. He is also the chairperson and executive director of Nigerian Youth for Development, and is a research consultant for the Royal United Service Institute for Defense and Security Studies. He's a visiting lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton. Only one person. He's a director and director of research at the Center for Africa Conflict and Development. He's also a faculty and doctoral supervisor at the UNICAF University and the Liverpool John Moore University, also the University of East London. Wow. He's a dissertation supervisor for master's degree candidates for international relations and international public policy at the Queen Mary University and the Cambridge Education Group. I have the honor to introduce Mr. Michael Nwankpa. Oh, sorry, apology, Professor Michael Nwankpa. I'll thank someone for you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for honoring the invitation. I want to thank the members on the high table. Thank you, Major Temera, for coming. Thank you, Professor Gaga. Thank you, Colonel Diba, who had to fly in from Sokoto at a very short notice. And thank you for Hadiza, who had to fly in this morning from Abuja. And thank you, everyone in the hall. Thank you to the young men. That is my high school. I used to be in the choir. I used to be one of them about 30 years ago. So I want to thank everyone for being here. We've heard so much today about democracy. So I'm just I would have loved to tell you the story behind this book, but because of time, I'll just go straight and talk about the content of the book. So this book captures Nigeria's current democratic dispensation. That is what we call the Fourth Republic. So the Fourth Republic is the period between 1999 until now, since Nigeria returned to what I call civilian rather than democratic rule. So this book is a snapshot of that period, which is just 20 years and maybe 3 years on top of it. So what this book does, it offers us a somber reflection of the last 23 years. So Nigeria has maintained, like I said, a civilian, if not democratic government in the last 23 years. This is a major feat for a country that has, until 1999, lived mostly under military rule. So, to this extent, we can celebrate Nigeria's democracy. However, Nigeria's democracy is highly militarized. In other words, so what I mean by that is, we have a pervasive military presence in an ideology in its political and socio-economic affairs. And also there's increase in the number of armed state groups and resistance movements. There's redistribution of resources away from social programs into military-oriented security measures. There's increase in security budgets. there's weapon proliferation, and there's an increase in internal military intervention. So the Nigerian military is actually intervening in about 2/3 of the 36 states in the country. And so, there's a general psyche and institutionalization of violence. So long and short, Nigeria has turned into a national security state where the rule of force and violence rather than compassion and dialogue reflect everyday reality. So this book captures this state of militarization. So it is divided into 8 chapters. The first chapter describes this state of militarization. So it begins with a critique of the 1999 Constitution. So my argument in the book is the 1999 Constitution constitutes the singular, most crucial contributor to Nigeria's militarized democracy. So it is a military construct, one that does not reflect the aspirations and experiences of the country or of the ordinary people. Also, despite in the Constitution we have provisions for amendments, but despite this, the Constitution is not fit for addressing the myriad of problems that Nigeria is confronted with. So also in this chapter, I also discussed the local geopolitics in the first administration, during the administration of the premiership or presidency of President Olusegun Obasanjo. So during this presidency, we had inter-ethnic conflicts. In the southwest, we have Oduwa People's Congress. In the southeast, we had Masob. We had the Bakassi boys, then turned Masob. In the north, we have the Hizbah groups, and then we had the group that came up what they were rightly called the political Sharia, the adoption of Sharia in 2001. So Obasanjo, a former military man, responded mostly militarily to these situations. So in chapter 1 also, I also talked about elections, which is quite very important to us in this climate now, with the just concluded elections. So I talked about elections and political violence in Nigeria in the Fourth Republic. So here I discussed how multi-party election is a veritable source of violence in our militarization in the Fourth Republic. So, but this is not a phenomenon that is peculiar to Nigeria alone. This is also observable in other African countries. So here we see that INEC, in the book I talked about INEC as the general body being vested with the responsibility of organizing and regulating elections, has not been free, not having the record of conducting free and fair elections. So because it lacks true financial and political autonomy. So but electoral democracy in Africa presents little substantial value, and as Prof mentioned, maybe it's high time, and that's one of the things I was recommending in the book. We started domesticating our democracy. So in this chapter, I look at electoral democracy in Africa presenting little substantial value. So the election outcomes are usually disputed, and the weak electoral governance system and other poor institutions fail to prevent pre-election and post-election violence. But there has also been progress. We can't not admit that we've had progress. But maybe there's a rollback in the progress. So in the book, I spoke about the Electoral Act amendments, where we were hopeful that there will be electronic transmission of results, and there will be results in real time. But with what has happened in the just concluded elections, maybe I was too optimistic in the book. Anyway, as part of the, I also discussed the groups in all the geopolitical regions that are vying for self-determination, secessionist drive. I talked about MEND in the Niger Delta. I talked about Masob, then IPOB in the southeast. I spoke about Boko Haram and several ISWAP and several other groups in northern Nigeria. And I spoke about several hundred socio-political movements in the Yoruba Southwest that are vying for self-determination and restructuring of the polity. So the chapter also highlighted the dangerous rise in Islamism and religiously motivated insurgency by Boko Haram and ISWAP. So I concluded with environmental related violence, that is climate change-induced violence in the Middle Belt, most especially the farmer-herder conflict. So, but one of the key arguments in the book is that militarization of Nigeria's democracy is a continuum of Nigeria's violent colonial and military legacies. So chapter 2 and 3 therefore present those arguments. So in chapter 2, I look at our colonial history and our colonial legacy. So from there, I look at one, the arbitrary creation of states. So Nigeria, like many other African countries, were created arbitrarily by the European colonial powers. Then I also looked at the politicization of ethnic and cultural identities, and then I look at the prevalent use of violence during the colonial era. Here I argue that the British colonial government supports and inflicted, the British and colonial government has left its mark on the people of several ethnic and cultural identities who are coupled together in a union against their will. And they manipulated and divided along ethnic lines, and whose resistance to the British occupation with its nefarious exploitative activities was brutally suppressed. So, but 62 years after gaining, or 63 years after gaining independence from Britain, Nigeria's development as a nation remains hamstrung by the colonial legacy. So, but yet I also argue that the colonial legacy of arbitrary state creation, while far-reaching, they are equally limited. They don't reflect the reality, the full picture on the ground. So while they are far-reaching, they are limited in explaining the militarization of Nigeria's democracy. There are other internal factors and local dynamics that help explain the militarization of Nigeria's democracy in the Fourth Republic. So then I moved on to the military legacy argument. So I began by analyzing military rule in Africa. Then I presented a brief description of each of the military rule we've had in Nigeria. Then I discussed the legacy of the military rule and its continued impact in the Fourth Republic. And then I ended with an analysis of the constraints of the military rule argument. So what I argued in this chapter is that the long years of military rule in Nigeria have enduring impacts on the growth and consolidation of democracy in Nigeria. So some of the legacies of the military rule include the obliteration of federalism that was instituted at independence, the imposition of quasi-federalism that is modeled on the American system of government and therefore alien to Nigeria's socio-cultural and political experiences, the overt centralization of power and balkanization through state creation, pure avarice and corruption, and entrenchment of a culture of impunity, oppression and violence, and the imposition of a military-styled democracy through the establishment of military-inspired constitutions. This continued to inspire and amplify inter-ethnic tensions and conflicts, secessionist movements, protest groups, and armed movements that challenge the legitimacy of the Nigerian state and its monopoly of the use of violence. But again, nevertheless, the 2 decades of democratic, or better still civilian rule in the Fourth Republic offers hope. Already there have been economic, social and political reforms that have been established as well as ongoing. So the further away, that is my opinion, the further away we are from the years of direct military rule, the more it gains pragmatic experience that aids the consolidation of democracy. But obviously, the colonial military rule remain important and have rightly dominated the narratives on the militarization of Nigeria's democracy. However, in the 4th chapter, I look at all the significant factors beyond these 2 historical legacies that contribute to Nigeria's militarized democracy. So the chapter shows the far-reaching impact as well as the limitations of the colonial and military rule legacies on the militarization of the Fourth Republic. It starts by discussing the centralization of power and the concept of the zero-sum game. It then discusses the notion of neo-patrimonialism and godfatherism, greed and corruption, and then it ends with a discussion of climate change, that resource scarcity and then competition. So the charter identifies one area where the link between the militarization of Nigeria's democracy and the country's dual colonial military rule appear weak, and that area is climate change. Although we can say during the late 70s, when Nigeria had the oil boom, the military may have inadvertently contributed to climate change through some of the white elephant project that was undertaken during this period, such as irrigation and stuff like that. But the charter provides that in chapter 5, I started providing empirical evidences through specific cases. I talked about here, I analyzed state armed groups such as Niger Delta, insurgent groups, Boko Haram. I analyzed the labor movement, that is the Nigerian Labour Congress, selected protest and resistance movement, analyzed the Occupy Nigeria protest in 2012, the NSAS protest in 2020, and I show how the repressive Nigerian state and the non-state armed groups and resistance movement reinforce one another in the production and sustenance of violence. Here in this chapter, I analyze the militarized nature of the selected armed groups, including how they instrumentalize this religion, ethnicity, and geopolitics in their struggles and contestations of power with the Nigerian state. So in chapter states, I engage with the gendered nature of security in Nigeria and the influence of the patriarchal norms. So here I consider the role of women in armed conflicts and Nigeria's militarized democracy. One, I answer two questions. Are women victims of violence, or are they perpetrators of violence? I also look at how Nigeria's Fourth Republic has been militarized against women from the perspective of security. So essentially, I consider women's participation or non-participation in Nigeria's security architecture by answering those questions. Like one, what role do women play in Nigeria's security architecture, in designing the security laws, policies, and practices? And two, I look at how much do these laws and policies affect women, and how much they protect women's interests. So lastly, the chapter focuses on Nigerian women in uniform, looking at in the military, how easy are they able to get to senior positions, what are the quality of them rising in ranks. So the conclusion reached is that women are undeniably victims of sexual gender-based violence, which increases during armed conflicts. We've seen that in the Niger Delta and Boko Haram cases. But also, I also say women are also perpetrators to some essence. Women are also perpetrators of violence in these cases. So then, looking again, Nigeria has established several gender reforms, gender policies in the Fourth Republic, following international, regional, and regional gender conventions, rights, treaties, declarations, and resolutions. So we see women are increasingly playing a part in shaping the discourse and practice of conflict resolution and peace building. Yet, the number of women in uniform is in decision making, broadly speaking, and leadership position in Nigeria is very low. We've not had a female president, we've not had a female governor, so these numbers are still very low. So the chapter concludes that understanding the importance of gender to security, and particularly the role of women in producing conflict, and conversely in building and preserving peace, is essential. It is also important that the number of women in uniform should be increased and an enabling environment for them to perform their services be created, including the creation of a fair system that guarantees that promotion through the ranks. So in the penultimate chapter, I looked at the contribution of Nigeria's foreign policy to the militarized democracy. So the chapter analyzes Nigeria's security or military relationships with selected countries such as the US, the United Kingdom, China, Russia, the United Nations, European Union, and other multilateral organizations. I also analyzed joint military operations with other countries, including the multinational joint task force and collaborations in the Gulf of Guinea. So lastly, I also look at Nigeria's increasing security and defense budget and spending, looking at the impact on regional security. So military aid to Nigeria through training and weapons sale contributes to the militarization of the country. Lastly, in the last chapter, I looked at a very important question: how does Nigeria attain a stable and demilitarized democracy? So in this chapter, I identified threats and opportunities to building a stable and demilitarized democracy in Nigeria. So the threats that are identified include the 1999 military-style democracy constitution, the overt reliance on oil-based economy and the oil revenue. So currently, many of the states, except Lagos or Port Harcourt, can hardly stand on its own. So we rely on federal allocation. So this disincentivizes healthy competition between states and state autonomy. I look at the security vote. The security vote is one factor that is contributing to our militarization. And I look at the absence of an effective and responsive law enforcement, looking at the police. And I was tilting towards recommending state police. So in terms of opportunities, I call for a reevaluation of our adoption of liberal democracy in the continent and the American-style presidential system. So in lieu of this, I recommended social democracy. I look at the teeming youth population as an asset, as an opportunity, which we've seen in this election, how it played out. I also look at women. Women constitute half or if not half of the population of Nigeria. So women constitute an opportunity to build in a stable democracy. So moving forward, Nigeria would have to address its political system and create a framework to address, that reflects, like Prof said, its peculiar socio-cultural and political reality. So Nigeria will have to, one, rely less on oil revenue and diversify its economy. This can only be possible with the decentralization and diversification of the source of power and economy. The over-centralization of political power and administration is detrimental to true fiscal federalism. So it encourages age dependency and discourages competition. So in conclusion, so the book Nigeria's Fourth Republic not only captures the state of our democracy in the last 23 years of civilian rule, which is undeniably militarized. It presents a critical analysis of the multifaceted factors that contribute to the militarization of our democracy. It goes further in identifying and explaining the threats and opportunities that Nigeria has in developing a stable and demilitarized democracy. I hope, therefore, that the book will provoke healthy debates and guided actions towards securing a true democratic society in Nigeria and elsewhere in the continent. Thank you very much.